I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce Jennifer Turner in the meantime. Yes, she will be introducing the panel. Yeah, no, that's okay. Jennifer is the director of our China Environment Forum, which if you do anything in China, you should know Jennifer. And if you have any questions about China's environment, you should ask Jennifer. And if she doesn't know the answer to your question, she will know the person who does. So I'm also going to invite our panel to come up on the stage as well. And we can go ahead and get started.
That was a great intro there. Jennifer equals China. Yeah. No, but the China Environment Forum, we've been around for a little over 20 years, and water has been a big focus of our work. We've done deep dives into China's coal water confrontations, looking at the water footprint of coal, which is huge in China. Led to a lot of changes there, wanting to address it. But yeah, so good. So I'm very excited. I get an easy job, but a fun job. I get to make an introduction of Sherry Goodman. Now, ECSP has had the incredibly good fortune of hosting Sherry Goodman as a senior fellow here at the Wilson Center. And many of you in the audience probably know Sherry for her many years of leadership in the security community and the critical role that she has played in elevating our understanding of connecting climate change and U.S. national security. One-woman show, you've done it. Sherry was the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security and a staff member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. She also served as Senior Vice President and General Counsel at CNA, where she created and led the CNA Military Advisory Board. This board has been really important because it's been the leading force to increasing the security community's understanding of the connections between climate change, energy, and water stress to U.S. national security. And the panel could be in no better hands than you. Whip them, keep them to time, ask them hard questions. Okay, Sherry?
Spoken like someone who's used to whipping the Chinese into the order she wants to have them speak and present here at the Wilson Center. So thank you very much, Jennifer. And first let me thank Lauren and Amanda, who have done just terrific work putting together this day. Just fabulous. Congratulations to you both. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I think we all agree that we had a fabulous morning. Each of the speakers, the keynotes, the panel really took both some very broad but unique and different, sort of not the same old business as usual perspectives on water, as well as some very interesting sort of deep dives and storytelling that are very enabling and I think powerful for the work that we are collectively trying to do. So I hope we can do at least half as well here. We do have a terrific panel, and I'm very pleased to introduce each of them to you. They will each speak for, 5 to 8 minutes, 10 minutes. You get 10 minutes, and then you get the axe from me. And we'll do some Q&A, and then we'll open it up. I know we'll have no shortage of questions from this very august audience and participants here. So it's my pleasure first to introduce Mike Safraga, who is the director now of the global, Jane said it's now the Global Risk and Resilience Program, which includes everything: environment, polar, water, resilience, maternal health here at the Wilson Center. And I've had the deep personal pleasure of working with Mike since he came to the Wilson Center only 18 months ago, and he's already had his Polar Initiative promoted to a Polar Institute. So that's already what we would call a battlefield promotion, and now he's got the whole program. So he is a geographer by training, but he really sees the world in a very unique way and is able to sort of connect across a lot of dots. And so that's really important in the work that he's been spearheading in our Polar Initiative, particularly in the Arctic, as we're really building sort of the place here at Wilson in Washington for all things polar and Arctic. And if you don't get enough of it today, you can listen. I think can no longer actually get in this room on December 4th, but when we'll have a big Arctic National Security Program. But Mike is going to talk to us today about the Arctic and the cooperation he and we all have been building in this region as it has emerged and changed very dynamically over the last decade or so. Mike.
Thank you, Sherry. Amanda, I think we're teed up. I, too, want to congratulate and thank Lauren and Amanda for putting together, and the team for putting together not just an excellent agenda, but the experts that you all are to come and speak with us today. I've got some closing comments at the end of the day. I'll share some more thoughts, but I can't thank you enough for coming here to the Wilson Center to share your expertise and to keep this narrative not only alive, but moving forward in a I think, a very critical time in our period here, not just for the United States, but also for the rest of the globe. So thank you for doing that. As Sherry noted, Sherry has been, I don't know if you mentioned Battlefield. I'll maybe perhaps you're my wingman on the development of our Polar Institute. But it is true, over the last 18 to 20 months, we have tried to build a place here in D.C. with programs in other places around the world focused on the Arctic and the Antarctic, but preliminary focus on the Arctic. More about that at another time. But I have been asked to sort of give an Arctic perspective to some discussion today regarding the oceans, water, many of the issues you heard about earlier in the day, but give it a little Arctic twist to it. This slide is from an op-ed that's almost done and a chapter that's almost done. And I struggled over time, as I was thinking today, you too must have struggled with this, to condense my narrative to something that is digestible to policymakers, educators, whomever I'm speaking to. And the only way I could figure out to do it was to take a little E.T. Barnum and great academic information and some long-term research and decades of experience and put it into a bumper sticker that says Navigating the Arctic's 7 Seas. Yes, it is schmaltzy, but it seems to have worked. When I have gone to different offices in this town and abroad, when I say the Arctic 7 Seas, I get this quizzical look. They want to know about the 7 Seas. I'm able to tell them then the story of our new ocean. The Arctic is no longer emerging. It has emerged. I heard this morning water issues, social, political, economical, environmental. Yes, the Arctic has changed at every level. Social, economic, political, defense-related, you name it. So I've come up with this, and let me just share some thoughts with you on the ideas of competition, cooperation, and other things. But to me, the drivers, which is consistent throughout today's discussion, are the following. Climate. Climate change is real. It is rapid, and it is palpable. That's what you said this morning, and that's what we all have learned. As an Alaskan, I know that because my own landscape, my modest 5 acres, are changing. They've changed in just a few years. I've been at where I'm currently living. But they're changing before our eyes. This is real, it is rapid, and it is palpable. Climate change is driving this Arctic narrative very much. A new ocean has emerged, and we have to deal with it. With that comes varying water regimes, fire regimes, all the things you may think about. It's all happening in the Arctic, but it's happening globally. So I could connect this morning many of the narratives to my own experience in the North and in the Antarctic as well. But one of the 7 Cs is climate. Commodities are driving this interest in the Arctic, which impacts a lot of different things I'll talk about in a moment. But commodity prices, whether or not LNG is viable on the market, who is drilling for what, who's exporting what where, who's investing in the LNG tankers, ice reinforced, who's purchasing them, who's building them, where are they going, and what are they moving? It's commodities. A lot of the Arctic narrative has to do with commodity prices linked to climate, more accessibility. What's the impact on communities? Communities is somewhere on there. We'll go commerce, but global commerce is hooked to the commodities. Commerce, who gets to say and how long might there be investments and where? How much do communities get to say what's involved in their landscape development? What indigenous communities are approached before development happens? Who gets to say who develops? What companies come in? Where do the assets get placed? On and on and on. So to me, that's another important C of communities. The connectivity is everything from telecommunications to us doing what we're doing here today to connecting the global world to the Arctic and the Arctic to the global world. We are now interconnected. It is globalization, and it's reached the farthest points in the north. If you could watch CNN at the top of the point of the world, you've made it. You're now connected. But who's benefiting from that connectivity? Who's driving the connectivity? What benefit to communities are there? What benefit to the resource management is there? So connectivity is very important in the Arctic. I mentioned communities. This is everything from local to regional to state to province to national to international. There are communities that are benefiting, but there are a lot of communities in despair, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But these communities are driving a lot of the Arctic narrative because the landscape is changing there like it is elsewhere in the world, and it's changing rapidly. Competition. There's economic competition. There's also competition for who gets what and where, who influences the future of the North. I'll talk about the Arctic Council in a moment. But the competition is everything from, should we be worrying about China in the Arctic? Should we be worrying about Russia in the Arctic? Is this a Arctic security, hard security, or is it all other security, water security, food security? I argue that it's the whole agenda of security issues. There are water security, food security, subsistence security. As migration of caribou change, villages are losing their food source. It's happening right now across the North, across the world. But for the North, that's a big thing. And finally, cooperation. Many people say that the Arctic still is a zone of cooperation, and to a large degree, it is. If you talk about bilateral relationships or non-relationships, if you look at the US and Russia, we actually have a couple of areas where we functionally have cooperation. One is in the Arctic, where the nations actually speak on a daily basis about a number of things. I'll talk about that in a second. International Space Station, that's an area of cooperation. But if you take the Arctic and the space station and you think about US-Russia relations, that might be the only two places where you have some really good groundwork to then move forward on. There are some other areas as well, but the Arctic and our space are two places where we actually engage all the time. And the relationships with the North and the Russia and the US and the Russia have been quite good. So to me, navigating the 7 seas is all about that ocean. It's all about that water. Because after all, the Arctic is influenced by an ocean, as opposed to the Antarctic where you got a continent. But to me, that's the big picture, and I can draw lines to things that you talked about this morning, to the very issues that we address in the Arctic. I talked about Arctic Council cooperation. Many of you know this, but at least in the Arctic, there is a framework for, quote-unquote, managing the Arctic. It's a consensus-building body. Nobody tells anybody what to do here. It's consensus building. But there have been significant agreements on everything from a ban on Central Arctic Ocean fishery that is good for at least 3 decades. So no one can fish legally in the Central Arctic Ocean until we have baseline research as to what is there. We simply don't know. It has been frozen. There are agreements on search and rescue. There are agreements on IMO, the polar code, what codes ships need to conform to actually operate in the polar regions. And I can go through 5 or 6 of these agreed upon Arctic Council-driven agreements that actually give us a framework for cooperation for this ocean. I want to quickly jump to connecting some dots. I put these in at the last minute because I was only going to do that slide and this slide, but I decided to do more slides. Because this morning drew some incredible parallels for me to the very issues that we deal with in the North. And again, my job is here to sort of bring the North into your discussions. There is a village, Newtok, it has the big bubble on there. We had village elders here last year talking about their plight. Their plight, if you take Alaska and make it Africa, or Africa, Alaska, or pick your region, it's the same story. Newtok is a village of 300 indigenous people. Been living there for as long as anyone could remember. And their lifestyle is in pattern and in harmony with the landscape. It just is. They fish at the same time. They hunt at the same time. That's all changed. And Newtok is being eaten away by a river that's eroding because the permafrost is melting, and storms that they have never seen before are coming on shore. Hurricanes are hitting the coast of Alaska that elders have never seen before because the ice used to protect it, and it no longer does. And that's happening all over the North, and it's happening everywhere in the world. So whether it's Fort Lauderdale or Fort Yukon, Alaska, it's the same issues, different scales, same issues. There's only 300 people here. But this is what's happening to them. Their landscape is eroding, and these are hooked to climate change. The land is literally melting under their feet, rivers are changing, and storms are surging. So you can see the storm surge from the impact of this kind of changing environment. But that's what their landscape looks like now. Newtok has about a year left. These are Arctic refugees. They will be moving. How quickly they can move is another story. Where the money comes from is another story. There are 32 to 36 endangered villages in Alaska. Each is going to cost somewhere around $120 to $150 million to move. And where do they move? And who gets to say when they move? Who gets to say why they move? Who gets to pay for it? This is just one small part of the Arctic world, and we're dealing with global issues here. But this is their village being inundated. Their buildings, I think the president of the village sat here and said, right, Sherry? Sat here and said, middle auditorium, the water is that far from this village. And they think they've got a year. In fact, he said, when I leave here, I don't know if my home will still be here. And that was last year. Good thing it still is there, but it's frighteningly close. That's what it looks like from the air. The ponds you see, that's their fresh water. That has now been inundated by seawater and river water and polluted at a level that the elders are really nervous about, and maybe this village gets to last another year or two, but they may have to bring in water until they get out. This is their new home, a new village, Bertarvik, which is about 9 miles upriver. It's going to be on bedrock. That's the outline of their new camp, but 300 people are going to have to be moved. This is one village at about $125 to $150 million for 300 people. So the social implications here are quite interesting and quite drastic, because these people have lived here for as long as anyone can remember, and they have not many choices. Stay there as long as you possibly can, which is about a year. 2, move to the great big cities, Anchorage, the great big city of 350,000 people, or Fairbanks, my home of 100,000 people, but you've uprooted a way of life. Or you try to solicit the federal government and the state government to give you enough money to move your village to someplace that will be sustained for more than 100 years, hopefully. So that's the issue that I have to address, we address collectively. But there's issues related to fresh water and food reliability. These are now Arctic refugees, and they are spread out across the north. So this morning, listening to the very issues, I could stand here, and you don't want me to, for the next hour, talking about each of the threads that were pulled this morning. So I don't mean it to be a downer. I mean it that we are all in this together, and I was very happy and pleased to see that there are resources, assets, tools, and people like you thinking about these very issues. And I'll look forward to some closing comments later on. And Sherry, I look forward to some questions and answers. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was terrific as always. I think I see the seeds of your TED Talk there in the Arctic 7 Seas. Okay. Next, we're very pleased to have Deirdre Warner Cramer with us. She is at the State Department as the Acting Deputy Director of the Office of Marine Conservation. What that means is she does everything fish. And there's lots to do in terms of fish. She does illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU, which has received a lot of attention in recent years. She also leads the U.S. delegation to the UN Food and Agricultural Organizations Committee on Fisheries and serves as the lead negotiator on U.S. delegations to a number of regional fisheries management organizations. And since 2013, she's chaired the negotiations to amend the convention establishing the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. I think all of us who like tuna are very pleased with that. And she's also written a number of articles, and she's been very engaged, keeping hope alive and keeping the work moving forward in terms of important work for fisheries globally. So competition, conflict, cooperation, you're going to talk about all of it, Deirdre, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. It's exciting to be here to have 10 to 12 minutes to explain everything there is to know about the world of international fisheries. Obviously, that's not possible. I need at least 15. Yes, competition, cooperation, lots of other C's. And I love that you said that I'm keeping hope alive, because I just came from the annual meeting of the International Commission on the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. and am filled with despair. So if I seem a little more Debbie Downer than usual, that's at least one of the reasons why. So let's talk a little bit about fish. We talked about water this morning, mostly focused on fresh water. Here we're talking about the saltier parts, but fish, of course, live in both. And when you talk about fish, a lot of the focus, especially when you talk about international fisheries, tends to be on the marine side. But fish in general are vitally important around the world. I'll throw a couple of statistics at you. Just a little less than half of the world's population, about 3.2 billion people, get at least 20% of their animal protein from fish. They rely on that as a source of food security. In some of the most food insecure regions of the world, that percentage is much higher if you look at small island developing states and some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the world's fish are caught in small-scale fisheries and farmed in small-scale aquaculture operations. About 90% of the world's fisheries activities occur in these small-scale fisheries, not the big, high-seas industrial stuff that people think about when they think about fishing around the world. 10 to 12% of the world's population gets their livelihoods connected to fisheries and aquaculture. Vitally important, again, both inland and marine. And fish are also the world's most widely traded food commodity. For developing countries, the export income that they get from fisheries equals in the aggregate, the export income they get from all other food commodities combined. So these are core issues, and they are inherently international issues. If you look at the world, this is a map of the world where the white areas are each country's exclusive economic zone, the part of the ocean that they can claim for themselves. And as you can see, that's a lot of the world, especially when you have a map focused on the Pacific, where the Pacific Island countries that are the teeny dots there actually have enormous ocean territories that are under their jurisdiction in terms of being able to control the resources. But you also have all of the blue area in between. And as much as we've been trying to get them smarter about this, the fish don't know where those lines are. And even though most of the fish that are caught around the world are caught within the exclusive economic zones of countries, nonetheless, they move freely between different countries' waters. They move freely between the high seas areas beyond the EEZs and their own coastal waters. So without international cooperation, without working together, there is no way to ensure this activity is sustainable. There's no way that one country on their own can try to manage their one tiny piece of that puzzle and expect that it will be enough. Because all you have to do is have the best rules in the world and have a vessel parked at mile 201 off of your coast, hoovering up everything that's left, and it doesn't matter what your science and your management says, you can't make that a sustainable activity. So these are inherently international issues, and as a result, you need to have a really strong set of frameworks in place, both legal frameworks, not so much hard law legal frameworks, but lots of guidelines, and you need a lot of diplomacy and a lot of talking within regions, among regions, and between countries. One thing I want to say, one thing we heard this morning was one of the challenges is if you don't know what the problem really is, you can't come up with solutions. You can't go in with an assumption. One thing I want to say is that there's a lot of attention now that's starting to shift to looking at marine fisheries and the status of marine fisheries globally. And it's true that a lot are not in great shape and that there are a lot of challenges. One thing you hear over and over again is that one of the problems is that the high seas are a wild west and there's nothing in place, that countries can do what they can with their own waters, but once you get beyond that, it's a free-for-all. That's not exactly true. A whole bunch of organizations exist and have grown up, in particular over the last 25 years, to take the process of figuring out how to share these resources, how to make them sustainable, how to ensure that fishing activities support those livelihoods, support the food security, support the economic and trade components, but are not otherwise damaging to the marine environment, and that they are sustainable for the long term. And we work on these at a number of global levels, including through the UN and through the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which are the two places you sort of set the global agenda, and all the big treaties, starting with the Law of the Sea and everything coming down from that, that sets the specific rules that countries have to follow on these. But also tremendous amount of focus on fisheries and marine issues in other organizations at the global level that traditionally have not focused on this. The International Maritime Organization for many years all of the rules they had in place for shipping safety and rules on pollution and all that sort of stuff specifically exempted fishing vessels. But now with the recognition of the interconnectedness of these issues, that is starting to change. Same with things related to labor, related to development, related to science. And in fact, there are specific marine science bodies that exist. But the other network that we have of international agreements are what we call the regional fisheries management organizations. These have chopped up the world into either geographic areas or certain kinds of fish that bring together the countries that have an interest in it, either because they have vessels that fish, because these species appear in their waters, or in the case of salmon, in their land, because they're a market, because a lot of reasons. Sometimes they just want to be there for whatever reason. But these organizations do three core things. First, they get all of the countries together to do the science that needs to be done, because you cannot manage fish until you know how many fish there are and how they reproduce and how they live. You can't know what sustainability is until you know where you're starting. So that science is done collectively through these organizations. Second, then, they set the rules. The countries together come together in these organizations and agree to a legally binding set of rules on how this fishing activity will be done. Everything from limits on total catch to closed seasons to protect spawning activity, limits on certain kinds of fishing gear, that kind of thing. And then the last piece, which is almost the most important, is they set up the rules on how everybody keeps an eye on everybody else to make sure that countries are actually living up to these legally binding rules that they've established. So these regional fisheries management organizations cover the stocks wherever they occur, almost. A number of them only cover the stocks on the high seas. And as we've already talked about, the fish go both places. So one of the challenges that we have is how do we still get the cooperation between coastal countries and those countries that are fishing on the high seas? And that's a lot of what we try to do as the United States, to try to create these agreements and relationships and discussions so that that can happen to complement these organizations. All of this should look very familiar to you because everybody's talking about blue economy, everybody's talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. There is one Sustainable Development Goal that is specifically focused on oceans issues and has a big set of targets and goals in place related to fishing activities. So this has become a common theme that's threaded together a number of other activities and a number of other policy areas to try to figure out how to tackle these things holistically. And one of the biggest challenges that we have when we talk about trying to tackle these things holistically is what we call illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing. There are certain other people in the US government that try to come up with cooler names for it, call it evil fishing or pirate fishing, but really it's IUU fishing. It's a terrible name. It was invented by Australians, so we can just leave it at that. It's a mouthful, but it is fairly self-explanatory. When you talk about things that are illegal, it's not just actually in specific violation of laws that are adopted in a country, but it's also anything that's contrary to that whole international framework that I glossed over very briefly. The trick with IUU fishing is that it happens everywhere. It's not just on the high seas. It's not just those big, rampaging, rust bucket vessels that have been hopping from flag to flag. That is the kind of stuff that tends to make it into the news the most. It happens everywhere. There are small vessels that cross over into neighboring countries' waters, catch fish, come back without authorization being able to do that. So how do you tackle it? If it's such a huge activity and it happens everywhere and it can be tremendously damaging in spots where it's particularly uncontrolled, how do you tackle that? A big part of what we try to do is create a multi-level effect. So first you need the laws in place. You need rules in place at a global or regional level that make it pretty clear what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And then you need actual implementation. You need to do that kind of capacity building and development that we heard about this morning in the context of dealing with water conflict. It's the same kind of thing. It also has to be adaptive. It has to be dealing with core capacities for institutional building, for governance, and all that kind of stuff. Because each of these activities is very flexible and can move from region to region, and it's very difficult to quantify. If you see down here in this diagram here at the bottom, one of the other big challenges is that IUU fishing is illegal, but it's not actually a criminal activity. And I just want to say, A lot of people like to use the term fish crime. The U.S. government says no fish crime. That doesn't exist, okay? There's no fisheries crime, but there is criminal activities related to fishing activity. And in fact, a lot of focus has now been starting to shift to the issues of, for instance, fisheries-related crimes. If you have some of these IUU fishing operations are big, high money value, multinational operations, where a big part of that is a lot of stuff that involves money laundering and international wire fraud and all sorts of things that are very traditional organized crimes. Also, increasing attention is coming to the idea that fishing vessels can be used for smuggling people, for trafficking people, for guns, for drugs, for contraband. If you have a fishing vessel that's in somebody's waters and they're not able to control those activities or even be aware of them, there are often other related issues that coastal country also can't pay attention to, that they're not aware of. You've seen direct connections between illegal fishing and terrorism and piracy that started to, some of the mix of issues that came together in the waters off of Somalia and started the big piracy issues there. The story goes that a lot of those pirates to begin with were fishers who were increasingly finding that they couldn't make a living anymore fishing, but they had all these big vessels going nearby, and they had the skills to be able to operate a boat, to be able to be out on the water, and they took the opportunity when it presented themselves. So what we need to do is we need to think about how these things are all interconnected and how to address them in an interconnected way. So I'm going to close up by telling you about one example of a huge initiative that took the last 15 years that is designed specifically to do that, to sort of get at each of these different layers at the same time. And it's called the UN and FAO Port State Measures Agreement. It actually has a long name, but I don't want to go through the whole thing. The whole concept behind the Port State Measures Agreement, which is the first binding international treaty specifically designed to deal with IUU fishing, is that the water is big. The ocean is big. There's lots of space to cover. There's no way you can know exactly what's happening. But the bottom line is the only reason people catch fish is because they either want to eat it directly or they want to sell it. And in order to do that, unless you're going to eat it on the fishing vessel itself, it has to come to land at some point. It has to come into a port. It has to enter into this chain of commerce. It has to be able to move from the water onto the land. So you can make a tremendous difference by having a number of clear minimum standards in place for what you, as a country who has ports, if you allow foreign fishing vessels to come into your ports, there are some very basic things that you can do where you can have a tremendous bang for the buck. And that's what this agreement does. It sets minimum standards for countries to use. To designate ports they'll let vessels come into, request certain information in advance, have a process in place for vetting that information and making a decision to say, if I have a signal, any of this information from here or from another source that signals to me that you have been engaged in IUU fishing, first is I cannot let you into my port to begin with. And the vessel has to go from port to port to port. It gets really expensive. And that is something that can be a significant disincentive for illegal fishing. Or you can let it into your port, but then you inspect it. You find anything, you can prosecute it, or you can hand it off to the vessel's flag state or take other actions against it. And if nothing else, you do not let these vessels offload their catch. You don't let them access port services. They can't refuel, they can't resupply. So the idea is if these minimum standards are in place in ports around the world, it becomes much harder for illegal fishing vessels to be able to make a living and to be able to continue to get away with what they're doing. So that's the global part. The related part is if you've got inspectors on a vessel looking for fishing violations, they can look at what else is going on there. If there are human rights violations, if there are labor violations, if there are signals of slavery or contraband or smuggling, those port inspectors can take action to deal with those other issues at the same time. So that helps get at those interrelated issues. And the final thing is this isn't just big vessels. This is anything. These are little vessels too. The idea is if you let a vessel in, you need to keep an eye on it. And that gives you the ability to know even for the small coastal vessels that may be sneaking off or fishing in an area they're not supposed to, you create an ability to get a better handle on this. The final, most important part of what this agreement does is it takes all of that and it creates a structure so that information can be shared. because if other countries don't know what is happening in the ports of a neighboring country, or what is happening with a vessel that's coming into their waters, if they don't have the access of what this, or information about what this vessel has been up to, then they can't make good decisions. So this agreement has now set up an information sharing mechanism that will make a huge difference. And in order to do all of this, there's a tremendous amount of capacity building work that's happening with all of the countries who are either already signatories to the agreement, and you can see they're on the map there, but there are also a whole other number of countries that are working on it. So the capacity building that's happening to support this agreement has spill-on effects of building that governance, building the institutions for broader cooperation on fisheries and fisheries management. This is just one example, but it's a really good one of the way that countries are now trying to deal with these issues in a holistic way. It's sparked by a particular problem, but creating a solution that can actually have a number of different spill-on effects to tackle even ones that were outside of what was originally targeted. So thank you very much for listening to my whirlwind presentation.
Alrighty. See how it goes.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. I think we're all now much better educated about the world of fish.
Fish.
Okay.
I thought the fish crime was loan sharking.
Yeah. Okay. As usual, Roger's helped introduce himself.
Hello.
And we're very pleased to have Roger Powarty here. He's senior scientist at NOAA, minister with many, many portfolios. I can't begin to introduce them all here. He's helped create NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System, the Regional Integrated Science and Assessments Program at NOAA. He works around the world with World Bank and many other international organizations. He's a senior advisor on climate adaptation and early warning. I'm sure I've left off a
Stuff
few
like
hats.
that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was one of the authors of the National Climate Assessment. If you want,
I see.
despair.
And we're lucky
If
to
want
have you here.
despair.
So you
Yeah.
want to,
So,
like,
sure. Well, thank
share
you for
some
having.
inside information with us. There you
Yes.
go.
Yeah. Thanks. So I'm going to speak a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
About islands. As you know, we're talking about despair. I always like to tell people. I once thought about being a pessimist, and I thought that's not going to work. So the idea is, I work for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's quite the place. We look at everything from the sun all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. So it's NOAA. It's not short for to no avail. It's no, anyway. So one of the things we want to get at is we think through the islands, and they only I'm from the Caribbean. There's only 7,000 islands, and how much time do we have? I'm going to talk about each one. But
We're bringing
it's
in
to
the
move
drinks
beyond this notion about what the role science plays in thinking through changes that are going on, and to move beyond statements like this. Experts say rainfall may lessen drought. Completely insightful, helpful, but a measure of certainty is in that, right? A whole world at risk from simultaneous droughts, famines, epidemics, and scientists. So let's think through what this means in the context of changes we've been seeing in the Caribbean, a little bit in the Pacific. I'm going to focus, we work a lot on islands, island regions, and you saw the spread of the EEZs and all of this around the world. There's the confidence in climate change impacts. The things you can't see down here are glaciers melting, terrestrial ecosystem impact, wildfires, marine ecosystems. They're the island regions. And what can we say about them? Marine ecosystems at risk, coastal erosion, livelihoods, and nutrition. And the measure of uncertainty is in these little boxes. And we're pretty clear about things surrounding fish and other things related to food security. And this has been constant throughout all of the IPCC reports. I was one of the authors on the previous Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as well. And so some of these things are staying through over time. But years ago, we also did a study showing that island regions, if you take the top 20 countries relative to areas that has a number of disasters, everything from earthquakes to droughts to hurricanes, by area, islands are the top 20 countries. That shouldn't surprise us. They're integrators of a whole lot of impacts over time and space. I always like to tell people it's one thing if you get something like Hurricane Katrina and you can migrate inwards, never mind all the suffering that took place, but if you migrate inwards on an island, you're on the other coast. And so the idea is we've had many efforts at trying to get ourselves around what we ought to do. And what I'd like to get at is what's the difference between what we ought to do, what we end up doing, and where the gap is between those two things. We know the risk factors are shore erosion, saltwater intrusion, things like that. We know what we ought to do, early warning systems, maintenance of drainage, regional risk pooling, relocation, smart infrastructure. As Mike was just mentioning, the nature of these types of risks are changing. What we're seeing in many places, but ideally integrated in island environments and the ocean surrounding them, are emergent risks, compound events, and rapid transitions. This is in the new national assessment, from droughts and heat waves to storms and floods and back again. This puts us away from looking at what's 2050 going to be, what's 2100 going to be, and working backwards into asking what's the nature of these fluctuations from the standpoint of our risks and our ability to adapt. I always like to tell people the human mind is wonderful. As you give us a complex problem, and sooner or later we'll solve it. It's the obvious that takes us longer. So if we think through some of this, there's 2017, the Atlantic hurricane season. 22 of 29 Caribbean states were impacted. 4 were affected by 1 storm, 13 by 2 storms, 5 by 3 storms. Very unusual situation. Maria was the 4th storm in a month to undergo rapid transition. It went from being a depression to a Category 5 hurricane in over 2 days. Hurricane Michael this year went from 2 to 4. At the same time that we were getting rainfall from Hurricane Harvey, just later in the year, this year, Kauai got the same amount of rainfall in 2 days. So we're seeing something else in the nature of the events, and I'll come back to what that means from our standpoint of collaboration. Maria could lower Puerto Rican incomes by 21% over the next 15 years, undoing about 26 years of economic development, provided that there are no other storm impacts in that region. And there are some of the migration figures as to places where people have gone. But there's a lot of internal migration as well within the Caribbean, and that starts to impact what we do and how we think. There's something else that happens in this region that is underappreciated because we think of the region as being vulnerable to hurricanes, yet the biggest risk in the region is water supply. Jamaica uses, during the tourist season, January to about May, 10 times the annual input from rainfall. So it's tapping groundwater. And the main reason is the tourist season, the fact that that's taxing everything. But what are we seeing? The 2013 to 16 Caribbean multi-year drought was the most severe and extensive of dry conditions since at least 1950. Appears to be not only related to El Nino-driven precipitation deficits, but also to temperature-driven increases in potential evapotranspiration. What we're seeing are critical transitions in the region to climates that we have not experienced before, from the unfamiliar to the unprecedented. This is actually true. This is in the data. We're not talking about projections. This move from floods to droughts and back is actually recorded. We've seen it in California. We're seeing it in the Midwest in 2010, 2011, and 2012, went from floods to drought, and actually was the first time since the Dust Bowl that corn yield declined in the United States. Right? So this whole idea of moving from flood to droughts and the compounding effects is actually a new area, but we're seeing it in the data and in the impacts. So what else are we seeing in the Caribbean? The globally networked risks. There's the world grain trade. There's the Caribbean. If you take the dark, the sort of orange-looking area there, that, of course, are the exports. These are the imports. There's the Caribbean, right? Mostly dependent on imports, food security being a big issue. There's the dependence on imported fuels, about 95% in total, into the island environment. There's tourism. Everybody knows about the Caribbean from the standpoint of tourism. It's only about 4% of the global tourist trade. So any sensitivity that happens relative to that begins to impact people. The markets have changed over time. They've been lost through the Lomé agreements for sugarcane, for coffee, and bananas. And as a result, the dependency on tourism is even bigger. And we have a set of things going on that. And what are we seeing? Venezuelan migrants throughout the region, right? Not only within, from places like Haiti and others for the Caribbean diaspora, but also this pressure from Venezuela on the islands of the Caribbean. Piracy, illegal fishing, or whatever we're calling it. being rampant throughout the southern Caribbean. Another threat. And of course, the last threat, which are our major imports, which is cannabis. And the idea here is that this is our biggest agricultural production. It's really good. If ever you want to go to a bank, you can open a joint account. And the idea here is, when did this start? Years ago, we did a study with Brookings that basically showed when Panama was shut down, after Mr. Noriega was taken out, drugs started to come in through the Caribbean. The trade for guns and drugs actually became not just transshipment, but markets within the Caribbean region. It's an interesting sort of take on the different drivers that we have. So what are we thinking? Here is a nice figure drawn by Amanda King in a project that Sherry, myself, and Lauren have going on, and there are other people in the room engaged in this. The key tipping points: hurricanes, floods, and droughts, the impact of coastal populations, the transnational migration and immigration, political instability, and the different drivers and indicators that we can actually measure. But the question always begs, from having worked, one of my mentors many moons ago, a guy by the name of Gilbert White, said, why, in spite of knowing better, are we losing more? In other words, in spite of knowing risk is socially constructed and we have the dynamics of culture and we have the dynamics of behavior, we're not making better decisions into the long term. We're making good incremental ones, and there are lots of positive indications. So the question is, why is that happening? So this is a great figure done by Amanda that integrates all of that. Well, one of the things we've tried to do in the Caribbean region is develop an implementation plan for a regional framework to actually work on these issues. And it's gone from being a plan to implementation through the network of partners who are in research institutions, governance mechanisms, financial institutions, people engaged in project implementation, local and regional groups throughout the region. This is a figure in the National Climate Assessment but we have actually worked with all of these institutions in trying to develop a regional strategy and a regional network based on implementing risk-based and resilience-based approaches in the region. And what has come out of that is something called the Early Warning Information Systems across climate timescales, being coordinated by the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology and the Caribbean Climate Change Center. They work very closely with what I call, if you're in the Caribbean, you might think there are cultural differences on language, or you might think that there's cultural differences in food or religion. It's which is the cricket playing country and which is the baseball playing country. That's the real sort of distinction between these two regions. There's a regional consortium, and as a result, facilitate a broader dialogue, facilitate the identification, all the things we know in this room we ought to do, but is in fact now taking place through this partnership. Well, this actually led to saving a lot of lives during the hurricanes last year. Actually getting warnings out to people, working with smaller communities because of the enabling capabilities that the Climate Change Center had done on risk assessment that actually reduced, we think, by the tens of thousands of lives from the hurricanes, and is now playing a big role in the redevelopment of places like Dominica and Barbuda. Another aspect that has been done is the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. They've paid out about $123 million, but the whole idea is this is one of the most innovative insurance schemes in the world. It's underwritten by Swiss Re, well now Willis Re, and the whole idea is to be able to pay people just enough to restart their businesses and their lives when an impact has happened. And this is actually one of the earliest ones of these dealing with environmental change. So where are we? In thinking through the future of the region, and I'll come back to why this matters to other islands, we have a set of scenarios we've developed. The cool runnings scenario, moderate growth, individualism, consumerism, islands in the sun scenarios, renewable energy, regional coordination, and I can't read that one myself. Ooh, the harder they come, Jimmy Cliff, right? For those of you who are ancient like I am. And then we have the Pirates of the Caribbean. These are scenarios we've actually developed in the region, and this is the biggest problem, the one that has basically global and economic risks of the kind I've showed, trade and crime concerns. And these are based on data, right? These are scenarios done with the region, done with the islands on the directions and the choices that can be made. But we're very clear that unless we get at the short-term risk, you're not getting at the long-term risk. And so we need to put this out of our heads that if we're dealing with incremental change, we're somehow not dealing with long-term. As the notorious RBG says, Any change that's long-lasting is incremental. So we have to think about how that fits into the longer-term planning. And these are actual scenarios. Similarly, we've done a lot of other stuff. I won't go as much in detail on the West Pacific, on El Nino, hazards, food and water security, driest period on record. Hawaii is 90% groundwater, declining size. And all of these, a lot of these activities are led by women in the region, are based on the free associated states risk between China and the US. And we can talk a little bit about that. I wanted to put this up just to show that while island environments face similar risks, their global and hegemonic pressures are very different. So what did our report say? Sorry, I'm speaking, this is the first time somebody's asked me to speak. Anyway, mounting threats to food and water security, infrastructure, public health, all the bad things, right? To sustain the region, many unique beliefs and languages. But we've known this now for about 30 to 40 years. It's now in the national assessment again. What we have not seen are the rates of change at which things are happening and the fluctuations between droughts, floods, hurricanes, and storms that have occurred in the past. That's pushing us a little bit over the threshold. So when we look too far into the future, it's like saying, hurry, the lemmings are gaining. Looking at the indicator that you can see, but it's really the one in front of you that matters, right? And so we want to get some lessons out of this. I call them lessons drawn, since we don't always learn them. As I like to say, we like to learn by doing to others, is the hydrological cycle, since we're talking about water, right? Apathy, drought, concern, panic, then it rains, and then we go back into a state of adjustment. What is learned by whom, and what do they do with these lessons? This is the rich question that we're asking. And Aaron Salzberg, I'm sure Aaron Wolf has good ideas too, but Aaron Salzberg had a great idea. Says, the idea of layering, and this is what we've really used to develop interdisciplinary program. Not simply saying, boy, integrated watershed management, integrated coastal zone management, integrated fisheries management. It's easy to conceptualize integrated approaches, very difficult to implement in practice, as we all know. And the idea is to layer the institutional arrangements, the information sharing and capacity development to work along the alignment continuum, the thing we developed for the National Adaptation Plans. Informal alignment, and this I can map what we've done throughout the Caribbean and parts of the Pacific on documents that we developed, the actors who are involved, the collaboration, the strategic alignment, the synergies identified in policy documents, the formal coordination mechanisms, the joint initiatives, and the systematic alignments. How do we get the result done? The shared vision for climate resilient development. And I always like to tell people there's a fine line between a hallucination and a vision. The idea is really how does information get into practice, and these are some cases in which we've done that. But more importantly, item 2, 1 is the alignment and that layering. 2 is the governing the risk assessment and management process, ensuring the authority and coherence, and this is the result of how we got to the things I mentioned, the culture of partnerships, decentralizing step by step, but really moving beyond really sort of trivialized notions of co-production into sharing not just data, but risks and opportunities. This is where the local matters, and this is where the regional strategies and standards begin to matter. And it means broadening the actor network, local communities and others that we all know, but that's actually the result that produces the most efficient outcomes. To begin to wind up, this, as folks have known, and this is something I have played a role in all 3 of these things, right? The Agenda for Sustainable Development. I co-chaired the SDG 6 for the US government, the Sendai Framework for the UN International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, and of course, the IPCC. These are the international frameworks that have allowed those things to happen, that have allowed the US, scientists like myself, working in the United States, to be able to have an umbrella and a strategy for governance of science, decision-making, and diplomacy. These have allowed those changes, and I think that opens up an opportunity for actually engaging with communities in a way that is non-threatening. The Barbados Program of Action, the National Adaptation Programs of Action, and the Global Framework for Climate Services. I chair something called the Climate Services Information System. So the last thing is anticipation and agility. Not just how do we adapt, but how quickly do we recognize the problem in order to adapt, and how do we make sure we're not doing the wrong thing more quickly? When do things go right, or at least acceptably wrong, and what has led us to being proactive? Early warning and windows of opportunity, we've identified those. The leadership and public are engaged at the same time, and there's a social basis for securing the common good. But there's one thing that Stephen Tolman, a famous philosopher of science, always liked to say: bad ideas have windows too. And so what else is needed? The collaborative framework between research and management, the idea that between science and diplomacy, is informed action. And individuals dedicated to championing the issue. The biggest success I think we've had in the Caribbean region has been a capacity development program we developed through the University of the West Indies, a master's program in which professionals in water, tourism, agriculture, community work come back and do a professional degree on assessing vulnerability and capacity, and then go back with money that we provide them through the Caribbean Development Bank, through USAID and others, for being the individuals that help make change in those organizations. This, to me, is how we get ahead of the game. So, thank you very much. I'm sure glad the whole isn't in our end, but we're all in this together. Thank you. There's the Marshallese calendar.
Roger, brilliant as always, and
Fully on time, too.
thank you. And it
Sorry, I
actually
meant
strikes
timely.
me that what you're doing with the students in the Caribbean is a little bit like what Mike is doing in the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, which is growing the next generation of talent that reaches from research to practice.
The most
and
dedicated
integrates,
people.
right?
The most
And really integrates because, as we well know, as we like to say in the defense world, a strategy without budget is hallucination.
question.
Right? Okay? So we see a lot of that, but then we also see research that doesn't have a user pull to it.
Yeah,
And
good
so
point.
it doesn't
Good
get
point.
taken up and applied by those who need it most. But now we're very pleased to have Rebecca Karnak from Dell, who is part of obviously a global IT company and who has a lot of experience in that area. Both a scholar and a practitioner and a former presidential management intern. And she's going to tell us why Dell is concerned about ocean plastics. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank
you very
so
much.
I'm thrilled to be here, and I have to say it's very hard to follow these three acts up here. I'm going to shift gears a bit and kind of dive in and give a private sector view and just a small case study on the themes that we're talking about here, the collaboration and especially the innovation. But I have to say I'm very hopeful to be among this group that all of you are doing the thinking and the collaborating to address some of these issues. So thank you for that, and I'm very glad to be here. So what I want to talk about today is how Dell is trying to, among many others, with many partners, work to tackle the issue of ocean-bound plastics. And you all know better than I do even what the issues are and what the problems are with the ocean plastic and the impact that has on health, on the marine populations, on human populations. And so specifically, I'll talk about how Dell is working to build the first commercial scale global ocean-bound plastic supply chain. Some of you may know that Michael Dell founded the company in Texas in 1984, and essentially Dell was founded as a supply chain company. And we have built on that history and innovated on that foundation through the years. And for me, the Dell Ocean Plastics Initiative is one of the initiatives that makes me most proud to work for Dell. And I'm grateful to have worked with some of the engineers who are really visionary and creative in the company who are carrying this out. And just a personal note too, it's one of the issues that my elementary school aged children have latched onto and asked the question that maybe you're asking today, which is, Dell makes computers, Dell is a technology company. what does that have to do with oceans? And so we'll talk about that a little bit. But since we are here with NOAA, I'll just make the side note that they're finishing up, NOAA every year runs a calendar contest on marine debris. And so my children are finishing up their submissions to that. It's due the end of the week. If you have kids under the age of grade 8, you can submit as well. And then the winning artwork will be part of NOAA's marine debris calendar. So just a little plug on that for you.
Karnak, is it? Yeah.
So before I get into the specifics of ocean plastics, let me just introduce and put into context why Dell cares about it and how we look at sustainability and at social impact and what we call our legacy of good, our impact on that. So the mission of Dell Technologies exists to create technologies that drive human progress. So this is reflected in our values, in our culture, in how we run our business. And so we know that a responsible and inclusive business unleashes innovation. It makes employees like me proud to be part of the company. Closer to my mouth, sure. And it helps to build trust with our customers and our partners. And so in terms of sustainability, it's no longer enough to, I'm trying to do a dance up here, both to keep warm, but also to keep entertaining. So it's not enough just to reduce an environmental footprint, but we know that the call is now to innovate with renewable and sustainable materials, to empower our supply chain as well, and also to enable customers to reach their sustainability goals. So 2030, we already got some good glimpses from the previous panelists on some of the challenges that we're looking at out all the way to 2050. And as a company, we are looking at these as well and trying to plan against this. And so I mentioned customers before. Customers is a lot of what is driving what our sustainability imperatives are. Customers are we call them our North Star, and they look to us to help solve both their immediate business problems, but also longer-term goals and challenges that they could face. So they want a partnership that goes beyond the bottom line and aligns with their core values and also their future vision. So we know right now that about 70% of our customer RFPs ask about Dell's responsible business practices and our sustainable products. And so we have a history of responding to that. And so part of what we talk about is the circular economy. And so as we look to 2030 and we look to a rising middle class, we need to think hard about how we can be more efficient with resources and how we redefine waste. So Dell, as I mentioned, started out as a supply chain company, and we've focused on reducing the impact of packaging by optimizing both size and using sustainable materials. And this is where we'll get into the ocean plastics piece. So what we want to do is focus on delivering in a circular way where another person's waste becomes a material input for someone else. And this, of course, keeps materials in the economy and out of landfills. And there are various ways that we've been doing this. In 2014, we launched the first UL-certified environment closed loops plastic supply chain, in which we put plastics retrieved from our electronics recycling programs back into Dell products. And so in the spirit of that, let's move specifically to the topic at hand, which is oceans. So again, why Dell and why ocean plastics? So again, you know all very well the threat that plastics in the ocean pose to the ecosystem, to the marine life, and to people as well. But the fact that jumped out for me was that scientists estimate that by 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And so in about 2015, Dell became aware of these challenges facing our ocean through our social good advocate, Adrian Grenier. And Adrian Grenier was the founder of an organization called The Lonely Whale, which is dedicated to bringing forward courageous ideas on the oceans. And so we believed that in listening to our customers, in working with these NGOs, that we could also, through our supply chain knowledge, make a meaningful contribution to tackle the issue of ocean-bound plastics, having spent already a decade in experimenting with some of the circular economy programs that I had just mentioned. So what are we doing? We want to help break the cycle by keeping plastics in the economy and out of the ocean. And so the goal and what we are doing and putting into effect now is the first commercial scale global ocean-bound plastics supply chain. So this has been developed in collaboration with leading researchers and advocates on ocean health. And the approach has been to intercept ocean-bound plastics in areas with the highest concentration of materials. And so we started after, it was in late 2015, with feasibility testing based out of Haiti. And by April 2017, we were able to launch our industry's first ocean-bound plastics packaging. So reclaiming the plastics and then recycling and putting it into the packaging for our, where we launched it was in our XPS, our premier consumer laptop. And so the pilot program, again, processes plastics collected from beaches, waterways, and other coastal areas, and then puts it into recycling packaging trays at a ratio of about 25% ocean-bound plastics together with 75% from other recycled plastics. And so we have used already about 16,000 pounds of ocean-bound plastic, and we have committed to increase our annual usage about 10 times by 2025. And so this program has scaled across our consumer laptop line, and the engineers and folks who are working in the program are also exploring other use cases beyond just the packaging to see what we can actually use in some of the products as well. And so the feasibility testing started out in Haiti. Of course, a lot of the electronic supply chain is in Asia. And so that is where we are focused now on building out the supply chain. And so in partnership with local government and collectors, we will invest in a market with one of the highest concentrations of ocean-bound plastic in the world. And in sum, we believe that this supply chain then gives us an affordable resource. This has to be commercially viable to make it work, creates jobs for recyclers, and provides a template for others to follow. And so what's next? Next wave is what's next. So again, Dell is one small part of it and are doing it in collaboration and coordination with many, many others in the research community, in the NGO community, and with other companies as well. And so we are committed to open sourcing the supply chain. The design to collaborate across industries led to this formation of the organization Next Wave. Founding companies in the organization besides Dell include General Motors, Trek Bicycles, Herman Miller, and several others. And of course, this is convened by Lonely Whale, the organization that I had mentioned before, and supported by UN Environment. So what will the group do? The group will continue to help develop that supply chain model to make sure that the supply chain model has the infrastructure and the support necessary to meet demand. And a key part for us as well is to make sure that we are aligning that supply chain with approved social and environmental standards. The companies have also committed within their own company and supply chains to reduce single-use plastic across the company footprint. So, in conclusion, it's a small part, it's a case study. We look forward to collaborating as much as we can with other researchers. We're grateful for all of you and the work that you're doing around it. We're just trying to do our small part and continue to innovate and bring those innovations forward. So thank you again for inviting me to be here today.
Rebecca, thank you. That was great. And you had no trouble following that distinguished lineup. You added to it greatly and immensely, and we learned a lot from you. Okay, I'm going to start out with a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. And I'd like to start by asking each of you, since we're living in this era characterized by great power competition, tell us about China in each of the areas that you mentioned. I know we could have a whole seminar here on China in the Arctic, so you only get a couple of minutes there, Mike. China, obviously, big in global fishing. So Deirdre, I know you have some thoughts on that. And Roger, in your work, as you alluded to that in the Western Pacific at the end, and I'm sure Rebecca in your work as well, competition, cooperation. What are the risks we need to manage, and what are the opportunities for cooperation?
We'll not do a seminar on it. Thank you, Sherry, for the softball. But I'll just 3 or 4 bulleted notes here. First is China this past year has released their Arctic White Paper. It's their how appropriate is that? Thank you. Background music like an elevator. Perfect. I'm just glad it's not my cell phone. China this year released their Arctic White Paper, which lays out their strategy. It looks like a lot of other places on the planet. It has to do with their One Belt, One Road initiative. They call themselves, as many of us know, a near Arctic nation. Now, I am a geographer. I've studied maps. It's a stretch for me to consider that they are a near Arctic nation, but that's an aspirational goal of theirs, but it also tells us something rather serious, is that they're serious about how they view the Arctic and how the rest of the world views the Arctic and what role they would like to play in the future Arctic. A lot of it right now is investment. The northern coast, northern sea route of Russia, it has somewhere between $15 to $30 billion, depending on who you're asking, in direct investment from China in LNG development to global markets, mostly to China. Well, if you take the northern sea route of Russia and you take a look at Africa or other places in the Caribbean or in the South Pacific, there's an infrastructure race and China's winning, and they're investing and they're influencing. So it's not unlike other places around the globe. This is all to the commodities part of my earlier presentation, where China really is trying to corner markets on LNG, oil, minerals, resources, strategic minerals. I mean, they're not going to get there anytime soon, but they sure are making a stretch of it in the Arctic as well. So I think we're seeing the beginning of these tension points where the rather massive amounts of money that they can invest, and our friends at CNA have done a nice analysis of this, areas that they can invest, they are investing and still have aspirations to invest even more, not just to get the resource out, but also to influence discussions at the Arctic Council as an observer nation and to lay out their sort of vision for a polar Silk Road, which matches their other Silk Road ideas and aspirations as well. So, China and Russia have not exactly been friendly neighbors. It's a relationship right now which is tolerated. It certainly gives the Russian government much needed hard currency. It gives China a diversification of natural gas assets. It gives them more working knowledge of the Arctic. South Korean reinforced LNG ships are being purchased and used in the Arctic, and so you see this growing immersion of infrastructure and also natural resource demand. It's that pull of the resource demand and diversifying their energy portfolio while influencing discussions in the future of the Arctic. I just condensed down a 6-hour lecture. Is that good?
Deirdre.
Well, the easy version of my answer is that only instead of LNG, say it about fish, and it's kind of the same thing. I mean, the need that China has for fish, for its domestic consumption, and for its growing population is huge. And so the same dynamics that you see playing out everywhere when it comes to natural resources are the case with China. China is entering into a number of agreements with developing countries to give access to Chinese vessels to be able to fish in the exclusive economic zones of these other countries, as their ability to be able to get what they need from their own waters or from their distant water fleets has been declining. So all of that dynamic, which also then includes often investments in infrastructure, in building ports and in building processing facilities in these countries, which can have a good spill-on effect, but often comes with a lot of questions about how well that activity is being monitored, how sustainable it is, whether the data is being collected that needs to go into the scientific studies, whether those activities that Chinese vessels are doing in other countries, EEZs, are actually being reported to the multilateral bodies that may exist that are supposed to be dealing with the management. So all of these things are phenomenally complicated, and we don't have a very good understanding of it. But without understanding that it's such a wide-ranging activity, and it's certainly an activity with a lot of impact. So there are a lot of questions there. But there's also just the push that China's been making both to continue to develop its own fishery. It's one of the few countries in the world that still is building many, many more fishing vessels, that subsidizes its fishing activities in a serious way. And there's an effort underway at the WTO to try to get some disciplines in place for fishery subsidies. It's been going on for a long time, kind of my whole career. But things are as close as they've ever been, but one of the tough nuts to crack will be China on that, because they have a lot of subsidies they need to protect. It gets mixed into some of the broader geopolitical issues, especially around sovereignty in the South China Sea, which has all sorts of fisheries overtones. But at the same time, that's all the complicating factors and concerning factors. China is also, in a lot of the same ways that China was doing when it came to climate issues a little bit ago, is starting to step up in some of the same ways when it comes to fisheries. That at least the government is presenting itself as becoming a better player, a more responsible player. For instance, I talked about the Port State Measures Agreement. China has not ratified that agreement for many years, said they couldn't. It was too complicated. That's a issue that's managed at the provincial level. They can't do it. And now they've said, no, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to ratify this agreement. We're no longer going to block port state measures being adopted through these regional organizations, which is the other way that the agreement is filtering down. So that's an interesting pivot, and it will be interesting to see. But what we see often that happens with any country is the instant that the country starts saying we're going to do a better job of controlling our activities and playing by the rules and engaging in these multilateral processes, the vessels say, that's great, and they go somewhere else. And we already see an issue now where there is the Chinese fleet that is actually fishing vessels that are flagged to China, fishing on the high seas in Chinese waters and in these other countries' waters, but there is almost probably a bigger fleet that is owned by Chinese businesses, but it is flagged under countries that may or may not actually control those vessels, may or may not control those activities. And the instant that it gets difficult for them to operate wherever they are, they jump flag and go somewhere else. So all of these things are huge challenges, and they're challenges with a number of countries. China's not alone in that, but its role as a driver of demand and its role as a source of fishing activity is really outsized compared to everywhere else, and we won't be able to tackle these problems without their help.
Roger?
Hello. Yeah. So, again, I mean, we can add, and I think there's a whole lot relative to the island's environment. Certainly in the Southern Caribbean, there's a huge issue surrounding their Chinese investments in LNG. There's a huge issue surrounding actually using regional agreements where they fit with the goals and then doing things just bilaterally relative to fishing and EEZs. But I think one of the biggest additions to make in this context, and I mentioned it just quickly in the context of the Pacific, but it's also happening in the Caribbean and certainly in the Indian Ocean. When there are events and there are disasters, these days the first country to step up is China, to be able to say that they're going to put money into recovery. And it's very much guided by two things. One, wanting to get footholds in those places, and two, as Deirdre was just saying, a strong effort to show goodwill. Now, whether or not these investments and the consequences of those investments are actually monitored, taken care of in the way that was being described is quite a different thing, but there is a deliberate effort to show goodwill in the context of climate change and climate change impacts, and they're actually stepping up to the plate in the development of the framework for climate services and activities like that. Just quick aside, I was having a discussion with the president of Nanjing University, and he asked me what I knew about Nanjing, so I went through its history and the imperial, and then he said, do you know about this famous sailor that came from Nanjing, Zheng Ho? And I said, yeah, he came back and said there was nothing to learn from the outside world. He said, we're not making that mistake now. That's exactly what he told me 1 year ago. And if you look at the way the investments are being made in the context of stepping up to implementing climate services and to implementing adaptation, China is doing that for several reasons, and one of them we see in the context of the Pacific when there are disasters and events. They're the first ones to be able to say they're going to put money into recovery.
I think I would just add to that for the Dell ocean-bound plastic supply chain, China is not currently a country that we're looking at doing that. We're in Southeast Asia instead. I would say that we like to see China in the forums where we're talking about this in APEC, in the AEC, and hope to see continued leadership on that. I think Jennifer would be able to outline better than any of us here some of the steps that China has taken recently in terms of environmental enforcement and upgrading the department, including to be able to respond on plastics issues. So we're glad to see that as well.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to open it now for questions, and let's take two at a time. I see a hand right here, and then another on my right. If you could introduce yourself, please. And
yes, Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and this is to Deirdre and also Roger. Michael, you're getting a pass because I'll be with you in a week or so. Deirdre, looking at the best practices of Iceland, I was over there and spent some days, did some television interviews from there. And it seems like they have a very integrated approach using drone ships, sea-based, all that to count the fish, what ships are within their territorial waters, what are actually parked outside of that, and taking account what can we learn from that would be useful to all the other places, particularly Sid's nations, and then to Roger, great entertainment quality there, young man, and what you were doing. But looking at the island nations, what is happening there through like the study you're talking about at the University of West Indies? I did some of my doctoral work with them. And how is that now replicating itself across the islands and making a real difference as far as where we're going in the future? Because, in some cases, they're much sophisticated. Other cases, kind of like Puerto Rico now, they need everything. Yeah. So if we could just chat. But all this is about the best practices and how that is going forward. And thank you for being here.
Thank you,
Sherry,
Sam.
good job.
Thank you very much, Sam. Okay, gentlemen here.
John Newman, NIH, retired. We have a problem in this country. Perhaps it's global. in which the private sector usurps a water resource and in many cases prevents the local population from accessing or restricting access to that same resource. Now, I was wondering what the panel's perspective was on this and whether there's anything that can be done about it.
Okay. Let's see. I think Deirdre, Roger, you got the first question, and we'll see how we answer the second one. Okay.
Yeah.
We have answers.
That second one, so that's a tricky one. So I'll answer the easy one first. Yeah, Iceland has really an extraordinary and, in fact, a model system in place for a whole lot of things when it comes to dealing with both its waters as well as its fishing activities. As you noted, its ability to collect information and to do science is really quite amazing. And the way it's integrated technology and it has a good idea of what's going on. And its fisheries management system is the most fully developed sort of system that we think of as individually tradable quotas. In other words, every vessel gets, or every fisherman basically gets, a certain allocation of being able to catch a certain amount of a given species. And they own that. They can figure out when it makes the most sense for them to go out and fish. And they've coupled that with a landing requirement that pretty much anything you catch, you have to bring back to land. So if you have a license for it, your authorization covers it, then you can keep it and sell it as normal. If you don't, they can actually get online while they're out at sea and trade with another vessel, say, hey, I've got a little bit more haddock than I'm allowed. Do you have some haddock quota you can sell me? So they might be able to keep it. And then if they land something they don't have an authorization for, it goes into a separate sale mechanism where it gets sold at a slightly different rate, and that money goes back into actually funding the fisheries management operations. So it works really well in Iceland. Iceland is also a very small country with very few vessels and a lot of fisheries resources. So their system is extraordinary, and there are lessons that can be learned by others, but they're really hard to scale up. And they require a level of access to technology. They require a level of trust between and among the fishermen and the fisheries management officers, which has taken years and years to build in Iceland. And they also require a manageable level of fishing activity. So there is certainly a lot of exchange that can happen there and a lot of information from that system that can benefit others, but it's not as easy to do as all that. But the one thing I will say is that Iceland and a couple other Nordic countries, including Denmark or Greenland in particular as part of Denmark, have kind of rebranded themselves along with some partners in the Indian Ocean and in the South Pacific as, instead of being small island developing states, they call themselves large ocean nations. They're trying to create some synergies as countries that have more water jurisdiction than they have land jurisdiction, and be able to figure out both how they can be working together to learn best practices from each other, but also sort of act as a group in some of these international fora in a way that's a very non-traditional alliance. It's not the developing country thing. So in fact, a lot of that best practice and a lot of that information sharing between Iceland and some of those countries is already happening. And that's been interesting to see. For a lot of the small island countries in the Pacific, for instance, they have huge fisheries resources. That's where all the fish are in the South Pacific. They're not in the high seas. But they don't have the big fleets. Instead, they license other fleets to fish in their waters. And trying to use some of those lessons of how Iceland manages and monitors their own fisheries in monitoring this third country behavior is something that's already happening. So yeah, that's a good question.
Right, so just to address that, and thank you for making the observation on the entertainment. I always like to say the issues are serious. Let's not confuse ourselves with the issues. Don't take ourselves too seriously. The idea here, what the university has done by trying to create these partnerships that I mentioned, was that having a public function, an academic function, and a private sector operating with its insurance and others has been the goal. The way we've been able to support the universities is to develop, one, the training that's needed and the in-depth training and analyses that's needed to do the vulnerability and capacity assessments, but to also do the modeling and monitoring that takes place at the level of research. Now, we know, of course, that the rush to get on the stakeholder train means sometimes that we rush research too quickly into practice. And instead, what has happened is we've taken things like the Caribbean Institute for the Mineralogy and Hydrology and the Climate Center to be those sort of intermediate institutions that fund the universities to do the work, to get the trainees, and then find the places for them in tourism, in academia, in water or some other sector, or working with small communities as well. So they play a major role. And the model that we've developed for thinking through how one crafts an interdisciplinary program that looks at context and looks at the science in the context of planning is actually based on an effort in the United States called the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program, where you build a university center, but you have public and private folks around them. And one of the best benefits that has done for the region is to show clearly that the innovations and investments for public investments have downstream private benefits. And the universities help realize that, as opposed to the, innovation comes from the private sector, which of course, we know provided all the base work has been done, so they can make those innovations, right? So the idea is to craft a set of centers, and this is the model for how the University of the West Indies operates in the context of climate, to be that center that does the incubation of new trainees, but to also do the modeling and monitoring that takes place in the region. And that's been very successful. Some very dedicated people, very interested in so-called use-inspired research. And that's basically the way we've tried to do it, while maintaining the integrity of the research. I think that's really extremely valuable for understanding the role of academic research in contributing to understanding risk, but also feeding into how we plan and respond. So. And anybody who's ever tasted hakarl, anybody knows what that is? That's the worst dish in the world. It's Icelandic green shark.
Okay, well, we won't have it on our next menu then. I think there was one more question about private water restrictions. That's something, anyone here? It may be outside the domain of any of the speakers here, unless Roger feels he can address that.
I actually think unless we're really serious about how partnerships between the public and private sector meets a public good, we'll be talking about issues around the private sector as, transferring assets and so on, which is what was mentioned. So I really think the bottom line question to it is what should be that public-private interface, and how do we understand it better so that standards of practice are met and equity is met and the environment goals are met while providing that economic outcome.
Right, and I know you've seen that globally. I'll relate a story. I had a chance just in the last 2 weeks in the Middle East to be part of a water and environmental peace building mission in Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, an area long plagued not only by political conflict but by water shortages. They're in their 15th year of drought in the region. Most of you know that, from its earliest days, Israel considered water to be a national asset. And so water is actually owned by the state in Israel. It's not owned by any individual or private user or public, so it's very carefully allocated, and it's, that's enabled Israel to sort of green the desert and have a very robust water sector. And at the same time, in Jordan and most parts of the West Bank and in Gaza, they suffer from acute water shortages, water mismanagement, and lack of adequate sanitation and sewage treatment in many areas. There's a group called EcoPeace that has been here a number of times at the Wilson Center that has directors from all three of those governance organizations that has been working to broker water sharing and water security arrangements among them. And despite the lack of peace breaking out in the region over the last quarter century, they have successfully created both eco-parks, peace parks. They're on the verge of enabling, the latest is what may be solar, Jordan to build and sell solar to Israel in exchange for water from Israel's many desalinization plants, which is also now being one of the more interesting things happening now is Israel is taking water from its desal plants and reverse flowing it through from the Mediterranean into the Sea of Galilee to actually raise the water levels there because it's in danger of shrinking to such a point where the largest freshwater body in that region could become saline in future years if not protected. So a lot of challenges in that region, but some small and very important glimmers of hope. You can just picture that. We all grew up. Most of us grew up singing this song, "Michael, row your boat ashore." Anybody remember that? And it has this phrase in there: the River Jordan is deep and wide. Well, the River Jordan is not deep and wide. It's about from here to Jane is the River Jordan today. At the most sacred site, the site where Jesus is said to have baptized in the water, and pilgrims by the hundreds of thousands come around the world, from all over the world, to bathe in what is basically now a sewer. There's no water flow other than sewage into this part of the Jordan anymore. And it's an obvious health risk, but it's also a very sacred site. And now there are efforts to restore it, but that will take quite a while. Yes.
It's coming.
And I had a not direct answer to that, but a related issue.
Fascinating panel. I learn a lot. I'm probably know less than anyone in this room, in spite of the fact that I'm from California. But on your point, Sherry, about desalinization, my understanding is that Israel partially, whatever the word is, desalinates water and can grow a number of vegetables with partially what is the word? Somebody? Desalinated water. And that's interesting, and I wonder if that has some wheels elsewhere. But the other point I wanted to make is I believe that they give water to Jordan and because of Jordan's efforts through the peace agreement to be an ally of Israel. And so I guess my question, more in my lane, is water is a weapon. Water is a reward. Water is a weapon. How much of that is going on around the world?
Right. Well, Jane, yes, Israel actually recycles over 80% of its water and uses most of the recycled water for agricultural use. Yeah. So in all the very productive fields up around the Sea of Galilee and even in the West Bank, it's recycled water. And in the South, yes. And that can be reused. I mean, we do some of that in the U.S., but I think we don't do nearly as much as we could and elsewhere. And yes, Israel does already provide water to Jordan. But the prolonged drought has reduced, has created further water shortages. And then there's the sewage treatment, which is another hugely complex problem because it's inadequate both in Jordan and in the West Bank, and particularly in Gaza, where the sewage comes, up the sea and onto the Israeli beaches. And there's additional challenges in resolving those issues. Okay, I'm going to look to Lauren. Can we go a little? How much longer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the question about water, I can't answer that, but I can talk a little bit about a related issue, which is actually a huge challenge. I'd mentioned in my presentation that so much of what actually the fishing activity that happens around the world is from small-scale fisheries, and we heard this morning about some of the challenges around land rights or lack thereof and lack of tenure, and those are even more of a problem when you're talking about fishing activity. The issue around having secure tenure and access to fisheries for small-scale fisheries and for indigenous communities and small-scale communities is a really big problem, especially because so much of this happens in areas of the coast where there are other demands on it from private sector activities. You have a land right given to build an enormous resort hotel on the coastline, and they want pristine beaches, and all of a sudden the village next door has lost all of its fishing grounds. or there are aquaculture operations that are developed that are building ponds offshore, which means that the wild capture fishermen can no longer fish there. And all of these issues are a huge challenge because they are purely national. They're not something that can be really done as an international issue, but there are core issues at play there that play into some of these international networks and legal structures that we have. So through the FAO, a few years ago, we developed comprehensive best practice guidelines basically for protecting small-scale fisheries, and in particular, how countries should be working to ensure that the rights are protected, that the special needs of these communities are protected, but at the same time, you can still do sustainable coastal development activities. And this is an area where there is a huge need for smart innovation to come in that is in partnership with the communities themselves to figure out how you can balance all of these core needs and not have the small-scale fishermen always the ones that are squeezed out.
Just one additional point. And there are parts of Jordan where many small towns where they don't receive running water. They don't have running water 24/7. They might have it only 12 or even 24 hours in a week. They talked about in some communities, the women, because they're the ones that manage the water, they are trapped in their house on the day of the week when they actually get water, because that's the only day they can do washing, clothes washing, and other kinds of things. The rest of the week, they have to just sort of budget from their house water tank, so that they have just enough, for actual cooking conditions. And now they're talking about reducing the water in some of these towns even further, which is going to push some of the smaller villages, people to sort of migrate within the region into the larger towns. So it's already, we've talked a lot about, in Africa, the tensions between the farmers and the urban and the rural migration, and you're beginning, I saw a real example of this where local villagers were saying, we're going to have to move into the next bigger city because we don't get enough water here anymore to be able to live on.
Sure. Can I make one? I wanted one quick. So as we talk about these as resources and extraction, I didn't want to lose the rowing the boat ashore in the River Jordan, because the whole idea there is water as a metaphor, right? The distance that one has to go. And I don't want us to lose in thinking about these things as resources, the sort of richer notion that water plays in our lives. As people like Aaron and others could tell you, the root of rivalis, or rival, is the person that moves across from you on the river, right? That's the river and rival have the same connotation, right? They origin from the same word. But they craft metaphors for collaboration in ways that we might not appreciate when we only think of water as an extractive, and which was part of the point that the gentleman was making.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Right. Okay, we're going to do one more round. Chris and gentleman here. And, okay, woman in the back. Okay.
So just as, as an observation on Jordan and water, there's a project now where waste streams from 3 million people are taken from Amman and then shipped into a wastewater treatment project, and then those waste streams are converted into 250,000 cubic meters of ag water, which in turn meets 10% of all of Jordan's water ag needs. And that shift towards the use of wastewater streams for industrial, agricultural, and human consumption ultimately is going to happen, and it'll happen, I think, far quicker than most people assume.
All right.
Great.
Josh Foster from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. This might have been a better question for one of the other panels, but since you touched on it, you talked about China and the role they've one resource I thought you were going to talk about was water. That China to some degree has been buying up water resources too. So maybe the larger question of geopolitical purchase of water rights by other countries so they can have access to that supply in the future.
Okay, and we had one more question from the woman in the back, and then we'll take a final round, and if Jennifer wants to add to that, you can.
Lori Krieger, I'm not sure I should say the name of my organization because this is a personal question. for you, for Sherry Goodman, and the two government folks. What kind of effect are you seeing from the current administration on your work and on what you think needs to be done with water?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, look, I'll take the sort of DoD side on piece on that one. There have been at least 18 statements by senior defense officials on recognizing the national security implications of climate change. Most recently, just in the last few weeks, by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dunford at Duke University, but starting at the beginning of the administration by General Mattis. Secretary Mattis, who said, climate change is impacting our troops where they're deployed today, and we have to up our game in the Arctic. Now, as to water, water obviously factors heavily into climate change, but there are water issues even separate and apart from that. The Department of Defense has been concerned about water scarcity and water supply, both for deploying forces and for U.S. military installations for some time. There's quite a bit. I was over yesterday at the DoD's Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program Symposium. There's a lot of research going on water availability for U.S. military installations and on providing clean water to deploying troops. When we had more forces in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade, that was a very big initiative of the Marine Corps. And then there's, of course, great concern about the risks of sea level rise to coastal military installations, everything from Norfolk to, of course, Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida was catastrophically damaged in recent hurricanes. So there's a recognition of the need to make those more resilient and the need to do so in conjunction with the community because, the bases aren't islands unto themselves, even if there are mission critical activities that need to be able to maintain power in catastrophic events.
Well, I can't answer a question about water, but I can talk about the oceans. And one thing to say in answering your question, I can actually give you a broader answer, which is that I've been working on these issues for a very long time through a number of different heads of my agency, secretaries of state, and different administrations. And one thing that's kind of nice about these issues is that when it comes to oceans and fisheries issues, U.S. policies are really consistent. Domestically, these issues can play out very differently, and they are, of course, sometimes very highly political domestically between different user groups and different decisions that are being made in domestic regulation. But when it comes to our international priorities, the United States continues to push for the vital importance of freedom of navigation, of fair use of the oceans, of continuing to be able to access the resources, so supporting our fishing industry's access both through direct negotiations with other countries, but especially through ensuring that the stocks are sustainable and that we can still have fish to support our huge industry. The U.S. is the single biggest single country seafood import market in the world. The EU beats us, but they have 28 countries, so it doesn't count. And so we care a lot about what we import and about making sure that what we're importing into the country isn't caught through illegal means and isn't unsustainable and doesn't have all sorts of negative effects. And so with the release of the new National Ocean Policy early this year, there was nothing in there that changes our marching orders, which is to continue to go out and bring the rest of the world up to U.S. standards, since we have some of the best fisheries management and ocean management here in our own country, and to try to make sure that we can continue to have sustainable activities. And the effects of what is happening in the oceans in terms of changes in the distribution of stocks and in populations going up and down is a new challenge. But our fundamental approach to that hasn't changed.
NOAA is a major contributor to those successes.
Of course.
I
It
just
should
thought
go
I'd say
without
that. Anyway,
saying, we do the diplomacy, they do all the real work.
Yes. Just thought we'd say that. So it's a good question. The direction in terms of the present FOSA has been towards working on infrastructure and investment and looking at produced, reused, and brackish water as alternative sources of water. Now, that being said, there has not been a change in the direction on trying to assess forest health, soil stewardship related to drought, water conservation and efficiency. That has not disappeared. So this mix approach, in which there's some emphasis now on infrastructure and investment, is an additional effort. But that has not reduced the data and analysis and the institutional frameworks for collaborating on drought and water scarcity. I sit as the NOAA principal on the National Drought Resilience Partnership, and that's precisely the focus that we have. So I'd say the addition on infrastructure and investment and on produced water, but as a mixed portfolio, as opposed to taking the place of something else like watershed stewardship.
Okay, well, I'm not sure we fully answered your question, but perhaps we can.
I can give you an answer to the market one. We don't have
The China.
And Jennifer, okay, Jennifer's got the mic. All right.
I have the mic, yeah. China, right? That we started the panel. So China, you guys, world's most populated country, very, very little arable land. So they go overseas and they acquire land for growing agriculture. For agriculture, you need water. So that might be what you're referring to for that kind of water grab. And then there's stories, in British Columbia, Chinese, buying access to spring water to ship that water to China. You should be aware that the Chinese citizens are not very confident about the safety of their water. So this is about, market and consumer, the consumers, 50% of China's water is probably, by Chinese standards, is not safe to drink. That's their own stat. So it's a big security issue. And again, China's thirst ripples globally. And I'll leave it at that.
Right.
Okay.
Yay.
Well, on that great final answer and a good round of questions, let me thank all of our panelists for a very lively and informed discussion this afternoon.